Jesus told them this was going to happen and they could escape it. If they chose not to escape it, then they would suffer the consequences of following their own self-righteousness, which was physical death. But that was really what happened. That's why he warned them of being thrown into Gehenna and all of those judgment warnings. Now, at the end of the day, that wasn't the end. It wasn't the end of them. They still were then transferred when they physically died. Those who did not believe in Jesus went into the fire, another fire, which was the consuming fire of God's love, to find Jesus as their Messiah. So God didn't destroy them eternally and punish them forever. He didn't punish them at all. They suffered the consequences of their rejecting the salvation that Jesus offered them. And that wasn't spiritual salvation. It was, but it was physical that he was talking about. When he said about Jerusalem, it was like, this is going to bring about a destruction. The Romans did it because the Jews rebelled against Roman law. Now, Jesus came and he was seen in the clouds over Jerusalem during that period of time, and even during that period of time, the gospel would have been preached and people would have responded to that. God never was like, turns his back on anybody or wants them not to come to the knowledge of the truth. But he warned them, and then they suffered the consequences of rejecting him. They rejected the stone. And they were building their life on what? Sand, not a rock. And what happens when a storm comes? That's what happens. The house doesn't stand any longer. And literally, that's what happened. I mean, see, all these things are the people who heard Jesus teaching understood that all these things were linked together with the day of the Lord and the Old Testament things. And they're all mixed with language, which is very Old Testament, But in reality, that language just framed something that then happened in reality, and it brought an end, because that was mercy. The early believers were being persecuted and punished and were trying to be brought back under the law continually during that period. And in the end, what they did, because at the end of the day, who brought Rome on them? They brought Rome on them themselves. So carrying on ended up in that happening. Now, you could say God used the Romans. Well, in a sense, yes, he did, but God didn't send the Romans. God used the flood, but God didn't send the flood. God used all sorts of people, but it doesn't mean he sent them. And I think, again, it's the concept of judgment. If you come back to what judgment really means, then you remove the punishment of it. God never wanted to punish Israel. He wanted Israel to come into the new covenant. And that's because you're reading the Old Testament in an undifferentiated way, because it was written in an undifferentiated way. Just because it says that God did something in the Old Testament doesn't mean that he did it. It just means that they wrote that he did it because that was their view. It's no different from today, the Muslim people believing that every bad thing that happens must have been the will of Allah, otherwise it wouldn't happen. The Jewish people had a very similar view. Any bad things that happened must have been God's will. And if it happened, the devil did it for God. Because they had a view which was very much viewing God like that, which was a wrong view of God. And part of the problem is we're reading a book as part of our Bible, which actually was not written to us and was written in a way, in a system, which was totally contradictory to what Jesus brought when he came, which is why he said, look, you might have heard all this, but now I'm saying to you this. So he summed it all up in a very simple statement. Love. He didn't make it complicated. He made it very simple. Base everything you do in love, because God is love. and all of those things, where an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth and vengeance and whatever, he could not have been saying that God, who is love, and now he wanted to reveal what God was really like, because he said, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. He could not be saying those things about forgiving your enemies and forgiving everybody and everything, and actually having a view of God himself, which was, well, God doesn't forgive everybody, and God punishes people, and God does this, and God wipes out this, and God commits genocide, and God tells them to do this, and God destroys children. I mean, he does not. He never did. But their view was that he did.